Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Corcione from Cordium, the Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Data Protection Services here. And I want to thank you for joining our webinar today on cybersecurity. And we are going to focus on the 3 lines of defense concept and model, and really what helps firms build to ultimately a good looking posture for cybersecurity for them. On the screen right now, you should be seeing instructions explaining the login process, and then moving on board next, we're going to come to a slide that will give you instructions that will outline answering questions. There we go. So you'll see you can submit your questions using the questions area in the GoToWebinar console. Type those in, and when we get to the end of this, we're going to be here for about 45 minutes of running through our 3 lines of defense overview, and then zoning in specifically on today's, which is a little more depth on the first line of defense. We'll have follow-up for lines of defense 2 and 3 and next week and the following week for them. So outlining our agenda, you'll see here, and we've broadly categorized where some of the industry looks and outlines what firms put together to help in multiple lines of defense, security being a posture of layers. And what I want to talk about today is really just a risk conversation. It's a business discussion, something that a lot of our clients and those attending this webinar today understand very well. And when you're getting to good cybersecurity, that's what really is the approach you need to take. It needs to be risk-based. You need to prioritize your efforts. This is what the regulators are asking firms to do, and this is the best approach, and really devising what is most practical for an organization and what's going to help them to define what's appropriate in their world for them. So a lot of it will be revolving around establishing effective controls, assigning the roles and responsibilities for the people that need to be accountable for those controls, and how it's an organizational-wide effort, and they're going to need to coordinate efforts amongst groups to make sure that you're not only identifying in the first line of defense where you're looking at detection of your risks and having an assessment process, but coordinating that with the second line of defense, which is where it'll focus on compliance, policies. This is where regulators like the SEC outlined they wanted to see firms have a written information security policy as well as procedures. So the second line of defense helps on drafting these policies, implementing policies, the governance, oversight, updating where needed. The third line of defense, where organizations come into and what ultimately helps and solidifies the cycle of security in your program, is testing or auditing. So third line is there to help give the assurance of the control effectiveness, its efficiency, oversight of your risk mitigation, and probably one of the better benefits or parallel benefits with the testing and auditing, it's also going to give you a measurement on the return of investment on your controls. So by understanding their efficiency, their effectiveness, you'll also get an understanding on if maybe you're doing too much. And so it helps really articulate to leadership where all these 3 lines of defense will ultimately report up to how they're getting a return on the spending or where a justification for future spending comes into play for them. So these are the 3 categories we're going to outline today and go into just a little bit deeper as we move forward on the upcoming slides. Today's focus will be primarily on detection, the risk management and assessment process as firms are moving into building a good cybersecurity program. So I mentioned before having a solid framework that firms put together to help establish the right lines of defense for them. So there are various frameworks and guidance issued by regulators and industry best practices. What ultimately is important to have something that can be recognized by regulators, something that you can show them has followed an approach that's in line with their guidance. On the first line of defense, where you're laying out this part of them, is the management controls, which is internal control measures usually tied with mid-level operational managers that help develop and implement the organizational controls and risk management processes. When you're working on the first line of defense, a lot of them are helping to identify certain significant risks. A lot of your first line of defense will tie to your tools and technologies, things protecting around the perimeter, somewhat your known inherent risks that you need to protect, and some of the user activities that you want to have preventions and controls in place that will not allow them to do behavior and activities that could make the firm vulnerable for them. So your front line of defense is going to be looking to secure the border of the organization, leveraging those tools and technologies. Also, part of it will be assessing the risk in the organization from a qualitative view, and we'll go through that in some of the deeper slides as we get a little further into the first line of defense. The second line of defense inside the organization, as I mentioned before, is going to focus a lot on developing policies, procedures around financial controls, around risk management, following up on the inspection of the risk management tools that are in place, reporting, the metrics that are coming back for them, really helping enforce and tying to the tasks associated with the first line of defense and those levels of risk for them. The third line of defense is going to be that function, as I mentioned before, with the testing. In larger organizations, this will be the internal audit group or somewhere internally in compliance where they're looking to see that policies and procedures are being followed, that there is a measurement of their effectiveness. In a lot of cases, it could be a third party that can be tied in to help in these areas for them. All three lines of defense are going to be reporting in some fashion, and in probably the second and third lines of defense more so than first would be to senior leadership. And where the art comes into play is taking things from a technical nature that are coming out of the tools and solutions and putting it into an understandable risk-based conversation for leadership. And we'll go through how firms can really articulate that well and what's going to be the right process for them. And then from senior management, we'll also form up to who the ultimate governing body is, whether it's a board of governors, an audit committee, the general partner. All of these will get the funneled up information on really what the efforts are doing to help reduce the risk that the organization could potentially be suffering from a cyber attack for them. External auditors also play a role. They're not necessarily part of the three lines of defense within the organization, but they can play a role in giving some validation on what firms are doing. In some cases, smaller organizations may leverage a third party to come in and help with some of those components of testing and task management to get the understanding of the efficiency and the effectiveness of the controls. So all these three lines, as you're coming through, are going to lay out and build a circular-based program that's going to start with the detection of your risks, so going through a risk assessment process, having those risks then defined and really the controls put in place around your policies and procedures on how you will manage those risks. And then your third category is going to be the testing and auditing of those controls, where now you'll get a measurement on their effectiveness, their efficiency, their completeness of where you may have some gaps or vulnerabilities, and then that'll circle back to the first line of defense where they'll look to reinforce that perimeter, reinforce that vulnerability, take the remediation efforts, update the policies and procedures, in some cases adding additional training into the employees so that they understand what's been put in place for them, and having this cycle go through for them. Coming through, and you'll see in your compliance and the policies, we're going to talk next there. They have their reports to leadership and management. They do in some cases operate somewhat independently because they are the ones that need to have that unbiased view when it comes to risk. And so their communication with leadership really goes beyond what you'll have on the technology side and taking that business lens as opposed to just on the technical viewpoint for them. So coming into our next slide, we'll go a little bit deeper into the first line of defense. In cyber risk management, as I mentioned before, and conducting assessments. So what the first thing a firm really needs to do, what the regulators are asking is, what is your risk profile? How do you identify your inherent risks? How do you get an understanding of what potentially could compromise your organization? What type of impacts could the organization have? And so what vulnerabilities might you have, and what would be the things that could impact your business? As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we're having a risk discussion. So every business, when they set out to make their money, accomplish what they want to do, is going to be a road where risks have to be evaluated. I always tell our investment clients that asset management space should be very easy for leadership to understand cybersecurity because they are evaluating risk every day. So in the same way you're evaluating an investment risk for certain criteria that could make it inherently more risky, you need to do the same thing when it comes to cyber. So risk profile will evaluate looking at the types of data your firm deals with, the type of territories where your firm is involved in, the type of business that you do. Your threat landscape now lends to what we call the attack surface, where your data lives, where it breathes. And we'll go into these a little bit deeper as we come forward with some other slides on how to define what your threat landscape, but understanding your connection to your third parties, their connection into your network, the extensions of your landscape through vectors like your employees' phones and tablets, multitude of devices now that are being connected throughout the network. And then ultimately, when looking at the cyber risk management and assessments, it's what's the impact. So that is how you'll best prioritize what are the risks by looking at what the potential impact could be. And that exercise will help firms narrow the threat landscape, because now you'll take your most risky assets and you'll try to narrow their access by employees. You'll try to narrow their storage locations and narrow the overall attack surface of where these lie. And that'll also help minimize the costs and efforts, because now you can zone in on what is most important. All of this really is accomplished by putting together a successful framework and approach. The regulators, the SEC has mentioned for firms to use a framework when outlining what are your risks, threats, and impact. So we'll talk a little bit more about the frameworks and the approach organizations can take. Ultimately, what you want to work on when you're taking an approach and establishing a good cybersecurity program and laying out not only your first, second, and third lines of defense, but to use an approach that is recognizable by the regulators. So coming down to the second bucket and the second part of the first line of defense before, as we mentioned, is going to be your defenses. So these are internal control measures, mentioned before, technology, tools you'll put in place, things like antivirus, things firewalls, routers, intrusion protection systems, items that will allow vendors to take response actions if needed, or individuals that can be there for response and reporting up to leadership. All these defense mechanisms help secure the organization. They are also going to blend in and tie into how you're going to develop your policies and procedures, how you're going to develop your testing. So very important to have the strong internal controls. They'll also report on the metrics and hopefully monitoring the risk to the organization on an ongoing basis for them. So we mentioned before assessing the inherent risk profile and security maturity levels in the organization. So part of where you start to assess the risk profile and what the regulators want to see firms do is that you've identified the crown jewels for the organization. So the crown jewels are usually viewed as sensitive data, key systems, business processes that could potentially be targeted by a threat actor for malicious intent or monetary reward, which could be negligence as well. And if those crown jewels are impacted, would have a severe negative impact on the organization for them. So going through a discussion, a business risk discussion, is very important for firms to understand what their crown jewels are, how you prioritize their sensitivity, how you prioritize their impact to the organization, how you prioritize threat actors that could come towards it. And I believe that's going to give us a point where we're going to come to a poll question. On my webinar here. So the poll is open, and just looking on, is it coming up? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, let's close it off. See what results we have. No? Here we go. So to the question we pulled out there, has your firm performed the cybersecurity risk assessment to identify your firm's crown jewels and the associated risks to them? 4% said we have no idea what they are. Several said we have a good idea but no formal documentation. A high percentage said they have documented them, and then 17% said they've documented them and shared with leadership for them. So it seems like a good half has gone through what the SEC has asked for, that you document your crown jewels. And in some cases, this will change. So not only do they want you to document them and have it shown what your crown jewels are and that you've evaluated it, but that you are routinely assessing what may change in your environment that could add to the crown jewels, that could also add to your inherent risk. Maybe it's doing business in another territory, somewhere in an environment that may not be as friendly or ethical, and that is more susceptible to have cyber attacks or threat actors, which leads to the next part of defining the threat landscape. And when going through the threat landscape, it basically comes down to that question of who would want to get the crown jewels. So let's just take back a step forward and talk about some of those crown jewels in your industry, the sensitive data, critical systems, and business processes. Where you look at sensitive data, for the 4% that said they didn't know what they were, and the others that said they may not have formalized them for them, we usually see clients at times may over-identify the crown jewels. And so you really want to make sure you take a narrow focus and look at the things that are most crucial. Investor data is always up there near the top as number one. Trade data and information research, algos, if you're a quant firm, definitely falls into the mix for them. In some firms, they're very concerned on any of their legal documents in regards to SEC discussions and items they have not been required to reveal that they would not want to have revealed for them. In the private equity space, you absolutely want to look at your deal information and then also your specific investments within the portfolio and cyber risk that you may have within each investment. Many people on this call have probably, I'm sure, seen the news with Verizon and Yahoo, and the Yahoo breach now leading to Verizon wanting to reduce the cost of the deal by about $1 billion. So understanding that aspect is part of your investment portfolio and a risk that you have there. Also one of the crown jewels that you want to evaluate. And of course the critical systems, this is where the data lives, breathes, and who touches it. You have to evaluate the key business processes. We'll have clients that'll say, well, all my investor data is kept by my administrator. I don't have to worry about that. They hold it all. But then you learn through the business processes that may be downloading reports with investor information that they're sharing internally. There may be emails that investors are copying them on that when were intended only for the administrator. That includes subscription documents. So you have to look at those processes and get an understanding of where that data is living, breathing, and who touches it for them. Now understanding the crown jewels and who would want them. One of the responses I've often gotten over the last several years from hedge fund and private equity managers, asset managers, when it comes to threat actors and being a target, that they will often say, we're small, we're only a few people, we don't have a large footprint, we don't have a website, we don't have any public exposure, we're not a target, nobody would want to come after us. Primarily, you're a target if you have a connection to the internet. So attackers out there now, and it's pretty easy for them, they can buy automated tools that'll troll through the internet looking for a vulnerability, looking for an open port, and then they'll get into your organization, spend some time, go undetected, and try to determine if you are a good target at that point by getting an understanding of your business processes and procedures and potentially something they could compromise, whether in a monetary transaction, some investor data or employee information that they could sell, put up on the public dark web, or not the public dark web, but the dark web, where bad guys are hanging out looking at this information, or even some of your trade research or information for them. In some cases, they may find personal information on executives called whaling when they're going out there looking for information they could leverage on a large bank accounts that people have, and really you become a personal target these days as well, especially when wealth detection is pretty easy to identify and know who has certain dollars. So that's where you have to know who may be coming after and attacking you for them, which I think will come to one of our next poll questions that we were going to come up on the screen, which is, have you identified, oops, I think we just lost it there for a moment. And as you see there, I'm talking about the threat actors, and you want to rank them. So competitors may not be the biggest in the asset management space. A lot of people tend to think it's somewhat collegiate and friendly. Nation states, absolutely, if you're doing work in business and territories that have that reputation, you'd want to have an extra level of concern there. Insiders, this is probably the #1 threat actor, and everybody tends to think all the employees are great and trustworthy, and that is in most cases true. However, it's also negligent employees, and that's probably one of the biggest areas that causes breaches, is just that lack of knowledge, the accidental, the lack of a firm having good policies in place that can really help keep employees in line and prevent them from doing things that, could accidentally cause a data breach for them. Okay. So we're going to skip over that polling question for them, but then you also have to look at, when doing your threat landscape, as I mentioned before, is how can threat actors get at your crown jewels? So doing an assessment of the mobile devices, physical cloud activity, your IT vendor, as well as all your vendors that could potentially have your data, have access to your network, or in some fashion could cause a compromise that could lead to a breach for them. So it's very critical for firms to go out, identify the risk profile, identify the threat landscape, and then when it comes down to the third phase, is looking at the potential impact. So what you'll have when you have the considerations on the impact, and really where you want to prioritize them based on the compromise of the crown jewels, I think everybody would admit that the biggest crown jewel in the investment space that I didn't put at the top, the sensitive data critical system and key business process, is that reputation. So you can't really quantify reputation. We talk a lot of times, or regulators mention in the conferences, there's always the discussion of cyber insurance, which is another topic I think we could get to at a whole other webinar just on cyber insurance, but you can't get that type of protection for your reputation. So what you'll suffer if you have a reputational impact is potential client defection, potential ability being crimped for raising assets in the future. So where we'll talk about reputation and how you're going to understand the impact there, it's very critical to know how you would react if you had a breach, and then how you can minimize the impact for them. The other types of impacts that you have to look at is monetary. So we did highlight here the obvious one, which is loss of funds. And there are a lot of firms that have pretty good controls over fund activities, funds transfers, fund movements. A lot of it is outsourced to the administrator, but you do want to be more in tune on those transactions. We're seeing actually a lot of firms start to institute callback procedures when it comes to wire transfers just to make sure that they can get that additional assurance that every box is being checked. When you're relying on a third party to handle these transactions for you, you have limited insight on their specific controls and their processes. So you want to create some additional layers on your side that can offset where you don't have that visibility. Another aspect in the monetary impact that a firm would have can be just around the time and effort that it's going to take to go through, remediate the effort, take action, put in other tools, other solutions, other items that can help rectify the problem. But there will be some effort that has to be there, whether it's internally or whether it's bringing in a third party. The other two areas of impact that we look there down at the bottom is the regulatory impact. So penalties, fines, being cited for a material weakness. I think a lot of the posture that firms took when the SEC guidance first came out in April of 2014, as well as the follow-up guidance in September 2015, is that it was guidance and that a lot of it may not have been hard, concrete requirements. However, the SEC has had a few cases, a few enforcement actions that they've put out that have levered other laws on the books, other requirements around privacy, around policies and procedures. And so those can be levered. They can result in enforcement actions coming down to organizations that may have not had the right the right security posture, and that has led to a breach for them. And then legal, of course, it can lead to lawsuits, especially when you're dealing with the breach of investor information. All of these have to be assessed, and putting together the right framework that can help outline what is the right approach for a firm, for an organization, what makes sense, what is practical for the organization. That's primarily what the regulators want to see, and that you are doing it on a regular and ongoing basis, and that continually monitoring your risks, monitoring your threats, assessing the potential impact, and reviewing your controls. So as we mentioned before and up front, the first line of defense is going to be around those tools, those technologies, the solutions that will be put in place for them, getting a better understanding of what's going on in the environment, getting a better understanding of what's happening externally that is trying to penetrate your environment, and then ultimately tying those into the second and third lines of defense that we'll be going through on our upcoming webinars as we go forward for them. We have one more polling question we're going to bring up. And this polling question is, do you know the full impact to your firm if your crown jewels are compromised? First box is, I don't know, and I hope to never find out. The second is, we have some idea about the impact to our critical assets. Third is, we've started to document some of the impact to our firm. And the final one is, we fully understand that our leadership is aware of the impact. So we'll give a couple seconds and then we'll talk a little bit more about that slide and about those questions for them. Just seeing a few more of the results coming in. Okay, great. Let's pull up the results. Okay, only 2% in that bucket where we don't want to be. A good percentage have some idea. Others are starting to document it, and it's excellent that we see 25% have a full understanding of how the leadership is aware of the impact. And I guess for those that aren't in that category of how do we fully understand, would love to ask their peers on the line here and dialed in as to how did they get that full understanding. I'll share some insight, and really we'll get to it further in our webinar 2 weeks from now, but it's going to come into one of those areas around the third line of defense where we mentioned doing the testing. So when it comes to understanding impact and tying into how you look at the different lines of defense and how it evolves for them, the second line of defense helps on an impact portion by developing a cyber incident response plan. Part of that cyber incident response plan is also going to be devising and looking at specific scenarios that would be relevant to your organization. So going through that exercise of what is the crown jewel, who would be interested in impacting it, how did they impact it for them, what was the extent of the impact, and running through what's called a tabletop exercise to test that cyber incident response plan and test not only the response plan from the technical aspect, but also from the business side. So when it comes to cyber, as I mentioned in the slide previous where you're talking about the impact on your crown jewels, reputation, monetary, regulatory, legal, when you go through a test of your cyber incident response plan and evaluating how an event unfolds, the first is the technical, where you're looking at what happened and really in a BCP mode about getting back online and getting back to business as usual. But there can be additional fallout that happens from a cyber attack, and whether it was client information that was breached, deal information that was compromised, or something else that had caused that harm to the organization, other people will need to be brought into play. So reputation side, it's going to be a matter of how do you communicate out to investors if need be. So that messaging has to be really thought through before an event, because the timing and the accuracy and completeness of how you deliver that message to investors is going to be critical. The results you may have on the regulatory side, so who in the organization is going to respond to the regulators if they need to be notified or if they come to you seeking clarity on any type of cyber breach or cyber activity that you had for them. And then on the legal side, and legal looks at it a few areas. So where may you have some legal liabilities? Where do you potentially need to bring in law enforcement? Cyber breaches, cyber attacks can be resulting in crime scenes. So there may also be the need to have a forensics retainer, a team that can come in on call, be there, have negotiated terms and conditions before an event, and there and ready when you need them at the most critical time for them. I mentioned before also too, when assessing the impact, looking at cyber insurance, still definitely a topic that many people are, I'd say, in the evaluation mode. We've seen cyber insurance prices come down over the last couple of years for them. We've seen more capacity in the market to take on the insurance. We're definitely seeing more clients, more asset managers taking cyber insurance as of the request from investors, and investors requiring or inquiring that they have it and giving them that little more comfort there. But it's a moving target. It's definitely something every firm needs to evaluate on their own, make sure that they're getting a full understanding of not only what the insurance would cover, but what are your requirements as a policy holder to protect the insurance company's assets, which would be not having a claim form. So there would be some things there that you'd want to make sure you're prepared to take on the tasks of outlining your program to a posture that would satisfy your insurance providers in those cases for them. So we've gone through quite a bit, and as we come to the end of just our early level discussion on the first line of defense, a lot of the tasks can come to be pretty frustrating. And I know we go through these conversations with clients all the time, and it sounds like it can be a painful exercise. But really, once you take the first few steps and starting to formalize your cybersecurity program, from documenting what is the output of your first line of defense, establishing a solid framework to do your assessment and risk-based profiling and landscape assessments on what the potential impacts could be. Once you outline that, it then becomes more part of your standard operating procedures. It gets integrated into your business on a regular and routine basis. So there is hope. There is help that it gets easier once your firm gets accustomed to the newer procedures that are put in. I know there's a lot of talk in the marketplace these days about cyber fatigue. I tend to equate the fatigue a lot of people feel around cyber as that it's not a check-the-box exercise, and that they've learned it is something that requires ongoing discussion within the organization. We're at a point in time where the challenges to an organization combating cyber are still not fully known, and will probably stay that way for a while. I know it is a challenging time we live in, We have a election going on today where even our government has come out and put other nations on warning about cyber attacks. I was on the train this morning with a programmer for a very, very large asset manager quant shop and said they actually halted new code rollouts today and tomorrow just because of it. So there's a lot to watch. There's a lot to keep an eye on. I think what is the best advice for most firms is that you understand it is a process. It is a matter of going through levels of security, levels of defenses, and ultimately that'll get you to what creates a good security posture for them. Coming into the next slide here, and we're just going to go through some of the outlines and kind of review some of the items we discussed through today's call. So starting with the framework and the approach on the first line of defense, it's looking at your risk assessment process. I've mentioned several times the word framework. The SEC and other regulators, a lot of them are zoning in on NIST. So it is a recognizable framework to regulators. It's very helpful as you're going through your assessment process to align it to something the regulators will recognize for them. Part of that process is in determining your inherent risk and also determining your cybersecurity maturity level, as well as specific gaps that your organization may have. So security is a matter of going from it's a matter of going from reactive to proactive. So as you are moving along the maturity level, it'll get more into how you are better at doing things in a more formalized manner, moving from ad hoc procedures to documented procedures, and then ultimately procedures that are tested, reviewed, and improved upon for them. Coming into the control activities that you're putting in place on the first line of defense, you're looking at your tools, the intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system, firewalls, routers. I always like to tell people the front line of defense is where you're really going to have a lot of those cutting edge technologies. However, firms have to take an appropriate approach when putting in new technologies. So we always want firms to still understand as you're reinforcing your first line of defense, you're looking for a better tool, a better solution, that you still want to make sure you have a solid vendor risk management process to have good oversight of these vendors as you're making your selections for them and you're putting certain ones in place for them. Coming down to the information and communication, as you are putting in new tools and solutions, there are going to be changes to the environment. So some training has to be handed down, not only for your internal staff, but also for your third parties. Examples could be awareness and training around some encryption technologies that a firm may now be putting in. Awareness and training around email attachments and how firms can be sending that out for them. Awareness and training and education on new policies around the use of the company email on your cell phone, on tablets, making sure that as the policies are being put in tied to the tools and the solutions, that there is education, that people have a good understanding. As I mentioned earlier, one of your biggest threat actors is the negligent employee. So having them understand what is expected when it comes to handling the firm's sensitive data, key systems, and business processes is ultimately important and needs to be reinforced with the education, awareness, and the training. Ultimately, coming down on the first line of defense too is the monitoring activities that go on in your organization. So a lot of automated tools can be put in place to monitor for viruses, malware, vulnerability scanning within the organization. There's also ways to monitor for phishing attempts into the organization, as well as also monitoring the effectiveness of your training by conducting phishing exercises. And really, it's more assessing the effectiveness of your training form. So it is a good exercise and practice these days within organizations to conduct a controlled phish of your employees to see if they have an awareness of what a spoof email would look like. Definitely the number one vulnerability for firms to be on alert for these days for. So in summary, those are the buttons that are going to come under these categories for your first line of defense. Evaluate and identify as part of your risk assessment process. So what are your risks, threats, impact? The control activities is going to be put in with your technologies. The information and communication is going to be disseminated through training, and then your monitoring and activities is going to come out of the reporting and what you're funneling up to leadership. A key element when it comes to reporting to that senior management, as I mentioned in the first slide, that reports up, is putting it in a way that they can understand, that is articulated to a message that they comprehend, which is why we always suggest taking a risk-based approach and having that in a fashion that they understand what would be the impact to the business, to the revenue the firm is trying to generate if you were to have the cyber attack, as opposed to more of the technical reports of how many emails you may have stopped or how many viruses may have been trapped. It's more from a risk-based view and what is on the threat landscape, what's evolving out there. It's pretty important for firms also to have some connection to threat intelligence sources, and that can be a matter of taking an exercise internally to read certain news articles and publications, or joining specific memberships groups or peer group organizations that will help for that mind share as to what are the biggest risks out in the industry, and then what are other firms doing to help improve upon those risks for them. So coming down to what can your firm do now? What I would like to do at this point is actually just take a pass through and see what types of questions we may have come on board and answer a few questions from the attendees. Okay, great. First question we have come across says, can you explain a little better what you mean by a framework in regards to an assessment? Sure, I definitely did not go into that deeper before form. So the framework is really going to be the outline of your approach, an example of what an assessment looks like when you're doing an approach against a framework, and what is a good recommendation for those that are SEC registered. They came out and specifically identified NIST as one of the frameworks. The National Institute of Standardized Technology outlines control objectives and categories, and basically a structured approach for firms to be able to go out and identify what type of risks they may have, establish how they need to protect what risks and what their crown jewels are, how they're working to detect what their additional risks and threats, as I mentioned before, the intelligence information, things that are going on in their organization, how they can effectively respond if they have a cyber attack, and then if they have a cyber attack, how can they effectively recover for them. Now, when putting together the framework for NIST, it is also important as an SEC registered firm that you would want to align that to the SEC categories. And so the SEC in their guidance has put out 6 defined categories that they've narrowed and consolidated from their earlier guidance, and the first is the governance and risk assessments. So in that category, it's a matter of how are you doing your policies, your procedures, your identification of roles, responsibilities, how is that structure and the overall governance of your cybersecurity program. The other 5 categories they're looking at is your access rights and controls. So you have to look at all areas, third-party providers, third-party services that you're providing access to, vendors that you are giving access to your network for them, your joiners, movers, leavers, all of those have to be reviewed and looked at and get an understanding on how well they're documented and how well they're tested. The other 4 SEC categories fall under data loss prevention, which is a multitude of solutions. Some of the ones we mentioned there, primarily in that first line of defense, around your firewalls, your intrusion detection devices, items around that nature that you can put around DLP to detect what's coming in and going out of the organization. Then the other 3 are probably the ones that are highest on the radar for our clients, the ones that require a lot more managerial decisions when it comes into it, and those 3 lead off with the vendor risk management, So a lot of that falls under how you are managing the layers of security. Second, one of those final top three is the training. How are you executing on training? We've seen a lot of variation over the past couple of years on firms looking to add it as part of the annual security training, to doing a more larger session once a year, to reinforcing with phishing and video training support, to now micro training and gamified solutions, role-based training. Ultimately, you want to have some training tied towards your policies and procedures. So where you're looking at, and in some cases it's going to be on the business side and in some cases on the technical side. So training is a continual effort within an organization, but in regards to data security, data protection, you need to have an semblance of a plan and a program. And then the third area that is the highest of the top three is that incident response I mentioned before. And it's probably one of the most critical. I tell firms it's probably where you can get one of the biggest bangs for your buck on an investment, because you are ultimately trying to minimize damage on your reputation. So I think we have a little more time for just two more questions. Oh, all right. So next one comes into what I just mentioned on one of the other ones, which is, can I share some thoughts on vendor and third-party risk management, what we mentioned as one of the top three categories for them. So it's a layered approach when dealing with vendor and third-party risk management. The traditional approach of having a questionnaire that you submit to be completed and received back, or getting a SOC 2 or an SSAE 16 or some forms of attestation will stay in play, but need to be complemented with other layers of security to be put in place for them. So you need to also look at the contractual obligations of the firm. You need to see if SLAs have been updated based on potential cyber events. You need to look at potentially getting an external view and doing some form of quantitative analysis on your vendors. Ultimately, what is going to help for vendor risk management, third-party risk management, is taking a risk-based approach and developing good workflows and task management. So how you organize and structure that, and a lot of firms have been doing it through spreadsheets, but now the tasks are expanding, and so there are tools and solutions available in the marketplace that make it easier, and technology tends to solve technology challenges, so that's where firms should be looking for, how you can develop good workflows around your vendor risk management. And then coming in, I think we're going to take time for one more question. Take a look here. Next question come in, and so what have we seen as one of the biggest struggles for firms? Probably the biggest struggle for firms are where we've seen a lot that have taken some action over the past couple of years, but need to get a little better or a little more refinement, is around documentation, which is a pretty painful exercise for most people in the IT technology space. And this leads into really what's going to be our next webinar, talking more of that second line of defense, the compliance group that has the governance, the oversight, puts together the appropriate level of documentation. What we've seen firms struggle with initially was where the SEC asked for a written information security policy, and firms kind of went through a checklist and jammed a bunch of stuff into a document, wanted it to be complete and robust, but also led to maybe too much information going in at some points. So it ultimately becomes, you have to have the right approach on your documentation. Some of it needs to be left in an area that can be more dynamic. It's good to have a version that can be shared with investors at more of a higher level, a philosophical level on how you're doing certain categories. And then really you need to build out the robustness in some of your more critical areas where you're going to want to have the testing component behind those controls, because ultimately it's the documentation that backs up the testing. So it's really having it in that middle second layer, second line of defense, having that good policy and procedures laid out that will ultimately get threaded to your testing and auditing, which is that third line of defense. So it is probably an area where most firms are challenged to spend a lot of effort towards, because there's the mindset of just putting something on paper won't make you safer. But when you tie it into the model of the third line of defense that now produces results in testing, efficiency, effectiveness, that circles back to the first line of defense where they can make improvements, is ultimately what creates good security for them. So as painful as the exercise may be, it will improve your risk posture, and probably equally important, it's going to satisfy the regulators, because for those that may have experienced the sweep exam from the regulators or any type of exam from the regulators, you're probably well aware that documentation request is something that they rely heavily on, and when not providing documentation, it's hard for them to get a good representation of if you're doing it and how you're doing it, unless they come in and go through an interview process that most people would prefer to avoid. So I will part with that thought, and want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. We are going to meet again next week at the same time, where we go through a little bit more in depth on the upfront discussion we had on the second line of defense, talk more about compliance policies, what good looks like from a policy perspective, and really what is going to give firms the effective, but more importantly, the appropriate and achievable level of compliance within their organization to get to good cybersecurity. So that being said, I want to thank everybody for joining today and look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.